This happened back in 2013 when I was 14 years old. My name is Jake, and I lived with my parents in a small house on the outskirts of a town in Pennsylvania. Our neighborhood was quiet, with houses spaced far apart, and plenty of trees surrounding the area. We didn't have tall fences or an advanced security system, just locked doors and windows like any ordinary house. That night, my parents had to attend a family event out of town and couldn't take me with them. They asked if I wanted to stay at Uncle Rick's house, but I refused. I had been left alone a few times before and nothing had ever happened. I felt mature enough to stay home by myself for one night. Before leaving, my mom cooked dinner and left a note on the kitchen table. Make sure the doors are locked before bed. Don't forget to turn off the porch light. I just nodded when I read the note. At around 7 p.m., my parents left. I spent the evening watching TV in the living room while eating leftover pizza from the night before. I wasn't glued to my phone like kids nowadays, so after getting bored with TV, I read a sports magazine I had borrowed from school. Around 9 p.m. it started raining. It wasn't heavy, just a light drizzle that made everything feel even quieter. That's when I first noticed something strange. From the kitchen, I heard a rustling sound outside the window. I didn't panic immediately. Our house was surrounded by trees, and small animals like raccoons or squirrels often wandered around at night. But when I turned off the TV to listen more closely, I heard another sound. It sounded like footsteps on the back porch. I stood still, trying to determine if I was imagining it. A few seconds passed, and then the sound stopped. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, but then I heard a click, like someone trying to turn the doorknob from the outside. At that moment, fear crept in. I grabbed my phone from the table and immediately called my dad. "Dad, I hear something in the backyard," I whispered, trying to keep my voice low so whoever was outside wouldn't hear me. My dad sounded alert. "Lock all the doors and stay inside. I'll call Mr. Henderson." Mr. Henderson was our neighbor across the street. He had known my family for a long time and was the kind of person you could rely on when something seemed off. I quickly locked all the doors and checked the windows. As I made sure everything was secure, I heard footsteps outside, moving from the back of the house to the side, then towards the front. I crawled to the living room and peeked through the curtain. A man stood on the front porch. He was wearing a dark jacket with a hood covering his head. His face wasn't visible, but from the way he stood, I could tell he was listening for something. I didn't dare move. I just stared at him, hoping he would leave. Then he stepped closer to the front door. He didn't knock. He just stood there for a few seconds, then reached for the doorknob and tried turning it. My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. The door was locked, but he remained there as if he was waiting for something. I thought about calling the police, but before I could, the porch light suddenly turned on. It was Mr. Henderson. He had stepped outside his house with a flashlight in hand, shining it toward my porch. The man at the door immediately turned around and walked quickly across the yard. I watched as he disappeared into the darkness between the trees. I stayed frozen for a few seconds before finally opening the door just a crack to look outside. "Jake, are you okay?" Mr. Henderson's voice called out. I nodded quickly. I heard someone outside. "I saw someone in your backyard earlier," he said in a low voice. As soon as I stepped outside, he ran toward the alley. A chill ran down my spine. If Mr. Henderson hadn't come out at that moment, who knows what might have happened. That night, Mr. Henderson stayed with me in the house until I felt safe enough to sleep. My parents came home early the next morning, and my dad immediately checked the security camera footage. The image wasn't very clear, but it showed someone standing near the backyard fence for several minutes before eventually walking away. We never found out who that person was or what they wanted, but after that night, I never felt comfortable being home alone again. I never believed in the supernatural. I wasn't the type to get scared easily, but there was something about this house that always felt wrong. I moved to Raven Creek, Montana about 3 months ago, a quiet little town, surrounded by forests and fields, a perfect place to escape the chaos of the big city. The house I moved into was an old one, built in the 1950s. a bit worn down, but comfortable after some renovations. I bought it for a surprisingly low price, though the previous owner seemed eager to sell. I should have known something was off. That night, the night everything changed, I had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room. I picked up my phone, but suddenly the screen went black. No low battery warning. I tried turning it back on, but it wouldn't respond. That's when I noticed it. Silence. Not the usual kind, but a silence so heavy it felt suffocating, as if the world had stopped. No crickets outside, no wind rustling the trees. Even the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen was gone. I tried to ignore it until I heard a soft knocking, not from the front door, from the guest room at the end of the hallway. I lived alone. I swallowed hard and stood up. Maybe it was just the old wood expanding from the temperature change, I told myself. But the knocking was too steady, like someone was in that room. I walked down the hallway cautiously. I reached for the hallway light switch, but the bulb only flickered weakly before going out completely. Damn it! I stood in front of the guest room door, grabbed the doorknob, and tried to turn it. Locked. I had never locked this room. I had barely even gone inside since moving in. The house had 2 bedrooms, and I only needed one, so I rarely thought about the guest room at all. I took a deep breath and tried again, pulling harder this time. After a few tries, the door finally swung open, and I felt sick. Behind the door wasn't the guest room. It was an attic. A narrow space with old wooden beams, torn insulation hanging from the walls, and dust so thick it coated the floor. An old light bulb dangled in the center, its pull string swaying slightly. I stood frozen. I lived in a 1-story house. I didn't have an attic. My heart pounded. I tried convincing myself this was a mistake. Maybe I had opened the wrong door, but no. I could still see the hallway behind me, the living room looking exactly as it should. I took a step back, and then I saw it. At the far end of the attic, someone was crouching. Not something. Someone. I couldn't see their face. They sat hunched over, their long hair falling forward to hide their features. Their body trembled, and I could hear their breathing. Fast, shallow, almost like sobbing. I wanted to turn around, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then slowly, they began to shift. Not standing, crawling. Their hands scraped against the dusty wooden floor as they moved toward me, their entire body shaking. I wanted to shut the door to escape, but I couldn't. I could only stand there, staring. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Silence. And in one quick motion, they lifted their head, their eyes. I don't know how to describe them. Dark, empty, but somehow filled with pure hatred. A coldness washed over me, sharp and suffocating. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The hallway light suddenly went out, plunging everything into pitch blackness. I felt it. A cold breath against the back of my neck. Someone was standing behind me. I don't remember how I got out of the house that night. I only remember suddenly being outside, standing in the backyard, my whole body trembling uncontrollably. The back door was still open, but inside everything looked normal. The hallway was just as it had been before. The next morning, I called a friend. I didn't want to go back inside alone. When we opened the guest room, it was there. The room was just as it should be. No attic, no torn insulation, no thick dust, no old dangling light bulb. But I knew better. I wasn't alone in that house. Since that night, I've never felt at ease here. Every night I feel watched. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night to a soft knocking from the guest room, and every time I check, the door is locked. I once lived alone in a house for several years. This happened quite a long time ago, but I will never forget this experience. It was my first year living alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of the city. I enjoyed the freedom, though sometimes I felt a bit lonely. I worked from home, so I spent most of my time there. One night after finishing work, I felt a little more relaxed than usual. I decided to play some games while having dinner. I don't even remember exactly what game I was playing, but I do remember how eerily quiet that night was. No sounds of passing cars, no noises from the neighbors, just me alone in the house. It was already quite late, so I decided to go to the kitchen to get some water before bed. As I walked through the living room, I felt something strange. I didn't know what it was, but an uneasy feeling suddenly crept over me. I ignored it and went back to my room. However, as I was lying in bed, I heard a sound from outside my room, like footsteps on the wooden floor of the living room. A chill ran down my spine. I knew I was alone. No one else lived in this house but me. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was just the house settling or the wind outside. But then, a few minutes later, I heard the sound again. This time it was clearer. Someone was walking slowly in the living room. I held my breath, listening carefully. Then I heard something even more terrifying. The sound of someone rummaging through the table in the living room. That's when I knew this wasn't just my imagination. Someone was inside my house. I lay still, pretending to be asleep. I had no idea how they got in because I was sure I had locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. Minutes passed in silence. I started to think that maybe they had left, but just as I was about to get up to check, I heard footsteps approaching my bedroom door. I could feel their presence on the other side of the door. They stood there, completely still. I could even hear them breathing. I didn't dare to move. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was afraid they would hear it. Then the doorknob slowly turned. At that moment, I knew I had to act. Quickly, I reached for my phone beside my bed and typed in the emergency number. I didn't turn on the sound or call immediately. I just kept my finger ready to press the call button if needed. I waited, hoping they would leave. Then slowly, I heard the footsteps move away from my door. I remained completely still, not moving an inch. A few moments later, I heard the front door open and close. I didn't move for several minutes. I wanted to make sure that whoever was inside my house was really gone. Finally, I gathered the courage to get up and check. I walked cautiously to the living room. Sure enough, some of my things were scattered around. My wallet was missing, along with my watch and a few other valuables. Strangely, the front door was still locked. No windows were broken. I had no idea how they managed to get inside. I immediately called the police. They arrived a short while later, but there wasn't much they could do. However, they discovered that the lock on my back door had been broken. After that incident, I never felt safe living alone again. I quickly found another place to stay and never returned to that house. It was the most terrifying experience I have ever had.